All right, this is exciting, isn't it?
Here we go, guys, in 5, 4, 3. Here we go.
It's time for Joan Esposito. Live, local, and progressive.
Thank you for the good programming. I appreciate the content and really enjoy every moment.
It's a privilege to have you on your station and listen. It's good stuff. It's very educational.
It's time for Joan Esposito on WCPT 820, Chicago's Progressive Talk.
Well, how long did you last? Thanks for being here this Wednesday, March 5th. I thought I could do it. I felt like I needed to do it. I tried to do it. I couldn't do it. I sat there for like an hour and I thought, okay, it's a bunch of wasted airspace. It's the same old, same old. He's smug. He's telling the same old lies that he's always told. I know what I'll do. I'll read a book. You know, I'll kind of just in the background, I'll listen to Trump just in case something jumps out. But I'll sit here and I'll just read my book. And then after a while, I realized that not even distracting myself with a book that I was enjoying very much could get me through. I'm not going to share any sound from it because you know what he said. The same old lies. You know, everything was terrible, but America's back, baby. It's back. And I'm thinking to myself, if you really love America and you want America to be back, why are you trying to kill the country? Just a simple request of it for information. Why are you doing that? And, there were a couple of little moments of protest. You know, Robin Kelly said yesterday that part of the reason she was going to attend is she was afraid that if she didn't attend, they'd fill her seat with a Republican. I don't really think that happened because, you know, the seats are pretty mapped out. The Democrats on one side, Republicans on the other. And I don't think maybe if the entire congressional caucus had boycotted, you know, maybe then they would have done something. I don't know, because there were empty seats. Senator Chris Murphy said he wasn't going to go. AOC said she wasn't going to go. Our congressman, one of our congresspeople, Mike Quigley, said he wasn't going to go. And there were empty seats. They occasionally took cutaway shots of Nancy Pelosi, who, you know, if you want to look up the word disgust, utter disgust, look it up in the dictionary and there will be a picture of Nancy Pelosi from last night. She looked, if she'd have had a copy of the speech, I think she would have torn it up. You know, I think she would have torn it up just like she did when she was seated behind Donald Trump in his first effort to try to lie to people and tell them that things were different than they know that they are. So it was exactly what you would expect it to be. Now, Donald Trump's been telling the courts that Elon Musk isn't in charge of Doge as a way to kind of duck some of the court supervision. But last night, he was like, and there's my good friend Elon Musk standing in the background, leading Doge. And, and again, Donald Trump is just so enamored of people who are really, really wealthy. You know, he doesn't have to do this. You know, he doesn't have to spend his time doing this. Like somehow Elon is giving us this big gift of his time and energy. Oh, God save us. I'm not going to share anything about what Donald Trump said because mostly it wasn't true. And mostly he was smug. But I am going to share with you a little bit about what Pete Buttigieg said about his speech. Pete Buttigieg joined Stephen Colbert on The Late Show. Either they taped it late or they did it live, because Pete Buttigieg last night was talking about Donald Trump's speech, which will go down in history as the longest speech to Congress given by a president ever. It ended up being an hour and 40 minutes. And I hung in there for most of the first hour. And I am so glad I did not spend any more time. And so here is a little bit of a summary of an observation of the Donald Trump speech to Congress last night, courtesy of our former transportation secretary on the Colbert Late Show, Pete Buttigieg. Listen to this.
Look, it was classic Trump, right? It was a lot of darkness and it was a lot of dazzle. But there was very, very little about the things that most affect our lives. I believe politics is about everyday life. It's about what government can and must do to make our everyday lives better. And the biggest issue on people's minds, the affordability of everyday life, is not something that got more than a few seconds of mention in his speech, nor did he mention some of the biggest things in dollar terms that he's doing. I mean, objectively, the biggest thing that he's working on is tax cuts for the rich. $5 trillion minimum. No mention in a speech that was, 2 hours? I think the longest of its kind ever, right?
Yeah.
But it's always like this, right? It's always going to be about, they're going to talk about Greenland and about pronouns and about mice and not about what's going to actually make our lives better.
Gee, what a surprise. What a surprise. It was dark. You know, he likes his wordplay, and he knows what's going to get the Republicans to applaud. America's back, baby. And he says a bunch of stuff. At one point, he was lying through his teeth, and I was watching J.D. Vance and Mike Johnson. J.D. Vance smiled from time to time, and I couldn't really tell if it was a smile because he agreed with what Trump was saying, or if it was a smile because he knew better but it wasn't going to say anything. It was a very enigmatic kind of smile. But Mike Johnson, oh my goodness, it was like he was in church and Trump was the preacher, nodding his head, yes, yes. When Donald Trump was saying the wildest, craziest, lyingest stuff, yeah, 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 bobbing his head. What a sad excuse for a man. Jim Acosta, who used to be on CNN, and they wanted to demote him because Donald Trump hates his guts. So rather than giving him a show of prominence during the day, they wanted to move him to midnight to 2 a.m., and he said thanks but no thanks, and he's gone out on his own. He did an online interview with former Capitol police officer Michael Fanone. They talked about the speech after it happened. Apparently, Jim Acosta specifically asked Officer Fanone to watch the speech so they could talk about it. And when all was said and done, Officer Fanone was not particularly happy that Jim Acosta had asked him to watch that speech. Listen to this.
Jim, I love you, and I have nothing but respect for you, but f*** you for making me watch that.
I deserve that. That's true. That's fair. And I welcome that. I want to jump right into it because I think you and I might get on YouTube in a few minutes here and go talk to Don Lemon, which that'll be a completely different kind of show. But
yeah,
let's talk about Trump's speech because, I mean, the part that I have to ask you about, you said at one point we must bring back law and order to our cities and our towns. I mean, obviously, he's completely leaving out the fact that he pardoned all those January 6th rioters and insurrectionists.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't think you're going to get too many people telling you that it was awesome, unless they are really drinking the Kool-Aid. This is a man who has no business being where he is. And I am so upset at the Democratic voters who found a reason to stay home. And I am so upset at the people who were somehow in their minds able to justify voting for Trump. But we are living in this reality, right? There was a bit of excitement before I bagged it last night. Congressman Al Green, Democrat from Texas, why, he was not going to take it anymore. He knows that in this budget, they're coming after Medicaid, and he represents a very poor district, and that is going to devastate his constituents. They are coming for Medicaid, make no doubt about it. And if you're sitting back there going, well, I don't use Medicaid, I've got private insurance, or I've got Medicare, if you don't think that this is the first volley in a war against all of these kinds of programs, you are misreading the room. Congressman Al Green made a fuss, kept yelling at Donald Trump. And actually, I thought it was interesting because when they finally escorted him out and Donald Trump picked up, he did seem momentarily derailed by that. After he was escorted out, Congressman Al Green was asked why he protested and what was important to him. This is what he said.
So what were you shouting to the president?
The president said he had a mandate. And I was making it clear to the president that he has no mandate to cut Medicaid. I have people who are very fearful. These are poor people, and they have only Medicaid in their lives when it comes to their health care. And I want him to know that his budget calls for deep cuts in Medicaid. He needs to save Medicaid, protect it. We need to raise the cap on Social Security. There's a possibility that it's going to be hurt, and we've got to protect Medicare. These are the safety net programs that people in my congressional district depend on. And this president seems to care less about them and more about the number of people that he can remove from the various programs that have been so helpful to so many people. It is the best way to get it across to a person who uses his incivility against our civility. He is a person who has consistently been used incivility against civility. Well, look, I'm willing to suffer whatever punishment is available to me. I didn't say to anyone, don't punish me. I've said I'll accept the punishment, but it's worth it to let people know that there are some of us who are going to stand up against this president's desire to cut Medicaid, Medicare, and Social Security.
Were you saying you have no mandate? Is that what you just said?
That's he has no mandate to cut Medicaid. None.
You may have heard the news. Thank you, Al Green. You are forever in my heart. You may have heard the news that Donald Trump is slowly but surely starting to hear from captains of industry that his proposed tariffs are going to hurt them. Oh, if only someone had told him. Oh, if only someone had told him. And Stellantis, Ford, GM, their leaders basically said, dude, we get a lot of our parts from Canada. You know, you're going to hurt us. And we're your supporters. We're your people. You're going to hurt us. So Donald Trump threw them a bone, a 1-month exemption for cars. Woohoo! Oh, my goodness. A 1-month exemption. On CNN this morning, they were talking to a guy who owns several car dealerships. And the news broke that Trump was going to offer this exemption. And I'm not going to tell you exactly his response, but essentially it boils down to, well, it's better than nothing, but it's not really going to fix anything long term. Remember Doug Ford? I shared some sound from Doug Ford earlier this week. He is the premier of the province of Ontario. Canada's provinces are not really like our states. They're more independent. They have much more autonomy. So the premier of a province has a lot to say. It doesn't have to go through the government, doesn't have to get things approved by the leaders of the other provinces to make a decision for Ontario. They have incredible autonomy. He was talking to Nicole Wallace. He has said, yesterday, he said that he was tearing up any contracts that the province of Ontario had with Starlink. Those were gonna be gone, and there was going to be a boycott. No government contracts of any kind were going to be given to any U.S. companies. That's what he announced yesterday. And then last night he was talking to Nicole Wallace about this decision, indeed, to implement these tariffs. You've got to remember, Ontario sells energy to us. There are at least 3 states, and it could be more than that, who are dependent upon energy that they get from Canada, specifically the province of Ontario, to keep the lights on. This is not a guy you want to mess with. But mess with him, Donald Trump is. Doug Ford was talking to Nicole Wallace. Listen to this.
You said this. Today I'm writing to every senator, congressman and woman, and the governors from New York State, Michigan, and Minnesota, telling them that if these tariffs persist, if the Trump administration follows through on any more tariffs, we will immediately apply a 25% surcharge on the electricity we export. We will not hesitate to shut off their power as well. Could the lights go out in some of those states where you supply electricity?
Well, that's the last thing I want to do, but I'm going to implement immediately 25% surcharge. We keep 1.5 million homes and businesses lit up in New York State, in Michigan, in Minnesota. I've talked to all 3 governors. And I have to apologize to the American people that we're going through this. This is totally unnecessary. We're your strongest ally. But to answer your question, yes, when our plants start shutting down and we have large unemployment lines and people are trying to pay their mortgages and put food on their table, I will use every single tool in our toolkit to fight back. And that's the last thing I want to do. Nicole, I love the Americans. I spent 20 years of my life in Chicago and New Jersey, and all Canadians love Americans. It's one person that's causing this problem. And it's unacceptable as far as I'm concerned. Let's continue building the 2 strongest nations in the world. I call it the AMCAN fortress. We have the critical minerals. We have the energy. We have the steel and the aluminum that you need. We have the lumber to build their homes. And he's going after it all. So what else can we do? We're going to start shipping it to countries around the world. And that's what we're going to do. We have more critical minerals than anywhere in the world right here in Ontario. So, let's work this out. Let's move forward. And let's be 2 great partners as we have been for a couple hundred years.
We do get I won't say almost all, but we get a ton of lumber from Canada. That is the wood we use to build houses. So if you think that somehow you don't plan to buy a car, so you're not going to be worried about this, or you don't live in one of the states that is dependent on Canada for their energy, this doesn't really affect me. Yeah. You know anybody who was trying to rehab a house, wants to remodel a house, wants to build a house? we are, as a world, so incredibly interconnected that you really can't hurt someone someplace and not see repercussions in so many other places. One last thing that I want to share with you before I wrap up this segment. We do have the phone lines open, 773-763-9278. Did I say that too fast? 773-763-9278. You can text me on that line. You can call me on that line. We're going to start getting to the phone lines in a minute. But you may have seen a little news item somewhere in the fire hose that is coming out of Washington. You might not have caught it. But there were a number of mayors who were asked by Republicans to come testify before a congressional committee today to talk about sanctuary cities and what it means to be a sanctuary city. Well, one of those mayors who showed up today was Chicago's Mayor Brandon Johnson. One of the people on that committee, luckily, was a friendly face, our very own Congressman Raja Krishnamurthy. And he had quite a conversation with Chicago's mayor. One of the things that he wanted to clarify was that Chicago isn't this horrible, awful, dangerous place that the rest of the world makes it out to be. It is not Kabul. It is not Afghanistan.
President Trump has said many things about Chicago, including that it is, I have this NBC News report, worse than Afghanistan. Mayor, I'd suggest the facts suggest otherwise. For example, Condé Nast recently named Chicago the best big city in America 8 years in a row.
A friendly amendment, best freaking city in the world, city of Chicago.
Chicago's the largest rail hub in America.
That is correct.
Chicago's a quantum technology hub in this country.
$20 billion new investment.
Chicago area is the home to the second most number of Fortune 500 headquarters of any city in America, right?
Just voted again the top relocator for corporate headquarters for 13 consecutive years.
And it's home to O'Hare Airport, the most interconnected airport on the continent. Is that right?
That is correct.
That doesn't sound like Afghanistan to me, sir, does it?
The city of Chicago is a beautiful place. We also have 20% of the world's fresh water right in our front yard. Our restaurants are amazing. In fact, everything that is dope about America comes from Chicago.
A Republican named Lincoln was nominated for president in Chicago, and a Democrat named Obama called Chicago home, too. It's the city of big shoulders, the heart of the heartland, the home to the world's best pizza. And we're not going to take any slander from Donald Trump or anyone else lying down. Is that right?
That is correct.
That is correct. We are a beautiful city, and crime is down. And we do have wonderful, wonderful pizza. We are going to take a break, and we are going to take some calls and read some texts when I come back after this.
Don't turn that dial. Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive, returns right now.
A fair balance where the facts come out.
On WCPT 820.
We are taking your calls and reading your texts right now. Carl, who lives in Kankakee, texted me that every day he texts a group of about 50 people, and it's just, a photograph and a few words, something upbeat, something to make their day a little brighter. But he shared with me a much longer post that he sent out today. And he's asking the same questions and making the same observations that a lot of us are. We seem to be forsaking our friends. We seem to be embracing evil. We are now apparently the axis of evil. He said, now it's more for the more and less for the less. This was not the way of my parents. It is not my way. And he said, let your representatives know what you think and how you feel, especially if you live in an area where your representation is from the Republican Party. they've got to know that their voters are unhappy. Otherwise, they have no reason to stand up to Donald Trump. They have no reason to go against him. Raina texted in that she didn't watch Donald Trump last night. She had to watch some paint drying. that paint, it dries better when somebody keeps an eye on it. And this is somebody also linked to a story that said that Elon Musk reposted a rant on X from Ben Shapiro, who's a real right-wing guy. And apparently Ben Shapiro is asking Donald Trump to pardon the police officer who murdered George Floyd, Derek Chauvin. I can't say that it's not something Donald Trump would consider, but man, oh man, you want to see violence in the streets? That would be the sort of thing that would motivate it. Let's go to our phone lines. Steve's on the line from the Gold Coast. Hello, Steve.
Hello there. Yes, I want to make a few points if I might. And if you haven't been paying attention, Republicans have in large part suspended their interaction with their constituents in many red states because they've faced so much backlash. As a matter of fact, the word came down from on high. If you can avoid these, don't do them. So we're not talking about, liberal or places where you have a blue-red mix. No, these are people from solid red districts who have gone home and whose voters have said, are you out of your mind? What are you doing to stop this psychopath? And, as a result of which, you're starting to see the kind of backlash that a lot of us predicted long ago, that where the Republican Party stands is an uncomfortable alliance with MAGA and the Trumpian world because they're afraid of getting primary down the road. But the reality is that a lot of them are terribly uncomfortable with a lot of this, that their voters rely economically and politically and all sorts of other ways on a system that Donald Trump is undermining.
That's what I think. I think a lot of people are hoping that because there are certain elected officials who see the outcome of some of these cuts. If you've got a number of nursing homes in your district, I think the 60, almost 70% of the people in nursing homes are getting payments from Medicaid. When you are smart enough to see what's happening and know that it is going to devastate your district, I think the hope is that no matter how many positive interviews they give about MAGA, that they will behind the scenes put pressure on Trump to back away. Breonna Kyler on CNN was interviewing some Republican woman who I didn't recognize, and I was screaming at the television for Breonna to interrupt this woman because this woman was saying things like, well, he's got to tighten the border with Canada because of drugs. And Breonna even said, and I know less than 1% of the fentanyl in this country comes through the border. Well, yes, but we've got to make sure that there aren't any gang members and terrorists. And I desperately wanted her to interrupt and say, excuse me, I just want to clarify here. You're saying that violent gang members, and terrorists are coming across the Canadian border, that's what's coming across the Canadian border. I believe I heard you say it, but I want to make sure I got that right. And then make her face it. But instead, the woman she was like a statue. She was like a deer in the headlights. And it was talking point. Oh, dear God, please don't interrupt me. Talking point. We need better from our news people. And we need Republicans who aren't going to do this kind of hypocrisy.
Yeah, this is the administration of talking points. So, if you bother to do any research, then you know that it's actually about a third of 1% of all the fentanyl that's seized, in terms of the borders of Mexico and Canada, that come from Canada. So, exactly, what are we going to do? Cut it down to 1/8 of a pound? A year? This is ridiculous.
It is ridiculous.
But again, they have these talking points, and that's what they rely on. And frankly, our best ally in this is Donald Trump. And the reality is that we still have to fight him on every front because unwinding the damage that he will do is going to be terribly difficult, and it could cost real lives. When people die because they don't get the proper health care and they can't feed their children and all of these sorts of things, that's not something we can unwind down the road. We can, and I think that the Biden administration did a wonderful thing, as far as foreseeing where this was going. They front-loaded a lot of aid to Ukraine, so it's going to take a while before the Ukrainians have to feel that pinch again. And, as long as you can get some sort of turnaround in the midterms and his poll numbers continue to plummet. I mean, keep in mind that he came into office only second to his previous administration in terms of negative poll numbers. So, he really has no mandate to do anything. And they love to talk about that. Yes, well, you have a mandate. No, mandate means that you got 50% plus one in terms of the people who voted for you. You didn't get a mandate. Sorry, you didn't.
No, it wasn't a mandate. It wasn't a landslide. It was like, what did he beat her by? Like 1.4% of the vote with tens of millions of registered Democratic voters choosing to stay home because of whatever reason, I don't know.
Exactly. I mean, a majority of the people who voted in that election, because there were more than two candidates, I know that the others are minor candidates, but still voted for somebody other than Donald Trump. So that means that you don't have a mandate. But, it was just amazing. This was basically a pep rally. This is not a State of the Union. This wasn't anything that was scheduled. And then he comes in, and because he's facing so much onslaught from people across the board, it's okay, let's spend the first 15 minutes talking about what a wonderful victory it was back in November. Because you have to go back to something that you can actually tout. Oh, yeah, well, that was good for election night, maybe the following week or two. But guess what? That's over. You're now governing. No one cares the fact about why you won or how you won. That's over. Now you have to govern, and so far what you're seeing is that the people who voted for someone else don't approve of you, and your own people don't approve of you. The stock market, the people who funded you, the big business people who love to see another tax cut, they're not terribly enamored with you. Because, they don't want their customer base eroded. They don't want to have to suffer the ills and toils of a tariff war. I mean, I can go down a long list. It's hard to believe that you can find somebody who in 1 week managed to make so many wrong choices on domestic and foreign policy matters. I mean, usually it's one or the other, but in 1 week, he breaks his own records constantly.
Yeah. And not in a good way.
Exactly. We have to keep fighting, and 2 years. I know it sounds like a long time, or like a year and a half now, but we have to keep fighting. The courts actually, good news on that front. The court said, no, you cannot simply do whatever you want and cut off aid to organizations and entities that were created by the Congress. So it was 5-4 victory on that note. But, again, it's a long fight. And at least the Supreme Court is not entirely in the pocket of this administration, but who knows on other issues.
Yeah. And we will see when push comes to shove. Just how much of this the Supreme Court's willing to swallow. Thank you, Steve, for the call. We are going to take a quick break and get 2 more calls right after this.
This is Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive on WCPT 820.
I am taking your calls the way I do for the first hour of the show every day of the week. Let us go back to the phone lines right now. David is on the line from San Francisco. David, thank you so much for the call.
Oh, thanks, Joan. Have you ever read that book by Naomi Klein called The Shock Doctrine?
The Shock Doctrine? No, I'm not familiar with it.
Well, she wrote it right after Katrina. You remember Katrina, New Orleans, after the hurricane, right? So she describes how the Bush administration intentionally allowed things to get so bad that the big corporations were able to buy up New Orleans at pennies on the dollar. Betsy DeVos was given the school districts of Louisiana. Exxon Mobil was able to get the mineral rights, a huge amount of land.
And did you see where Betsy DeVos's brother's company is now buying ports on the Panama Canal that Hong Kong has been pressured into selling because of things that Trump has been saying. They're being purchased by BlackRock, which is the group that Betsy DeVos's brother runs. So, yeah, the grift is still on.
Yeah, exactly. So I figure that what Trump is up to is he's intentionally crashing the economy so that everybody in America is going to be forced to sell their best stuff for pennies on the dollar, and pennies on the dollar, if not worse. They'll have to give it up to seizure or something like that. So the idea of before April 15th, if Elon Musk has gotten his hands on the Treasury, we, the people, need to make sure that the U.S. Treasury is not refilled on April 15th. Take every tax write-off that you can get. Put your money into your IRA. If you can put money into an IRA even after January 1st and backdate it to last year. And so make sure that the Treasury is not refilled this year, because it's just going to go to Trump's pocket and Elon Musk. And if you don't have an IRA, find a local charity that you can get a tax write-off on, a local charity that does something tangible good. That that the money is going to stay local with the local charity. Put it into local bond issues. And I've called the WCPT on a couple of shows talking about this, and the mayor is catching hell from the right-wingers. Well, the mayor might have a list of, like, the sewer bond issue, or the fire department might have a bond issue, or, any number of different local bond issues where you're putting your money into a local, you're keeping your money local this year. It's not going to go to the federal treasury, and it's going to starve Donald Trump. And, if you're looking at the stock market for the last couple of days, it's crashing because Donald Trump is becoming so erratic and he's lying so often. We, the people, have an ability to control the value of our lives. And if Donald Trump is going to try to take the gold of America and put it into Bitcoin, and then Bitcoin is going to, create shady different maneuvers and lessen the value of the U.S. Treasury, well, we can lessen the U.S. Treasury by putting it in local investments. And that's going to play hell with those boys, because they, crooks fight among themselves, right? Yeah. And there's no honor among thieves. And
Not these thieves. There isn't. Dave, I gotta wrap up. I got a bunch of callers to get to, but thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to hear from you. Let's go to Palos Park. Ed is on the line. Hey, Ed.
Yeah, hi, Joan. We're just wanted to comment in the speech last night there. We said in utter disgust as we watched it, and certainly very predictable. Mm-hmm. The lying, the belittling, on and on and on. I mean, I could barely make it through, to watch it all. And then, he goes into this mealy mouth dialect, which is sickening. He talks in that little soft voice, like he's looking for sympathy or whatever. What I couldn't understand, the constant bombardment of Joe Biden. I mean, saying things against him, well, he always has, that were totally untrue.
But he cannot stay on a positive message. Usually when presidents address Congress like that, and by implication, the United States, they want to tell you how great everything is and how great they're doing and how great this and how great that. He's not like that. He never has been. He's got to trash somebody. And in a perfect world, he gets to trash a lot of people. Why is he still trashing Joe Biden? I think because he's still bothered by the fact that people think Joe Biden was a pretty great president, and he doesn't hear that himself very often. So, it's just like he used to go after Obama and still is Obama. I mean, he's just a petty tyrant and a bully.
Right. And also, this thing about the worst economy, horrible. I mean, things were great during Joe Biden's reign. And he won't admit that. Well, naturally, he won't admit it. I mean, but such a blatant lie to say that. And the media runs with that, instead of saying, oh, this is inaccurate, totally wrong, a lie. No, they keep pushing it. And I think that's a big reason why he's hanging in there like he is, these believers. And, with all these people let go in the government, I wish there was a way to find out what percentage of them are Trump supporters. Because, that would be very, very interesting to see.
Well, we're starting to hear their stories. I was talking about not the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post. This woman, she worked for the Park Service. She voted for Trump even though she thought he was a sexual assaulter. She voted for him anyway because, he said he would give free IVF. And now she doesn't have free IVF. She voted for a sexual assaulter, and she's out of a job. So, you know what? There you go. How's that working out for you?
Well, it's just one negative, horrible situation after another. And I'm wondering if treason is in the forecast for him. Because,
I think we're there already. I really do. I think he is. He's so deep into Vladimir Putin that treason doesn't even begin to cover it. Ed, I got to wrap up. I got to try to get to some other callers here. Thank you so much for calling in today. Let's go back to Santa Monica, California. Our good friend Naomi's on the line. Hello, Naomi. How are you?
Hi, Joan. How are you? Really quick things, okay?
Okay.
Okay, the first one, I think it's very instructive to see who the orange idiot doesn't criticize when they complain, when they criticize him. Bernie, for one, and there's somebody else, and I can't remember who it is. I think it's very interesting because Bernie's always willing to criticize everybody.
Interesting.
And anybody. Yeah, isn't it? And then there is somebody else, and if I think of it, I'll call you. Next thing, there was a woman I know. She played guy speaking to me, talking. He was pontificating about politics or whatever, his ideals, etc. And then she wanted me to guess who it was. I couldn't guess who it was, but I said, "It's a liar." She says it's Elon Musk. Interesting, huh? And then next thing, everybody's saying that this is going to go down as the longest State of the Union speech in history. Well, I don't care. I just want him to go down.
I like that, Naomi.
Yes, I had to give that to you.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I appreciate it. And thanks for the call. Always good to hear from our friends in California. Ron is in Chicago. Let's go to him.
Yes. In his 2-hour speech, did he ever mention global warming or climate change? Is that...
Well, not in the time I was there, no. I don't think he talked about any environmental issues. He somehow claimed that the price of eggs was better under him when everybody knows it's not. I don't think that was what Pete Buttigieg said. He didn't talk about anything that mattered to real people.
No. And Al Green was escorted out of the room. Do we remember a couple of years ago when Biden had his State of the Union address and Marjorie Taylor Greene was screaming at him the entire time he was giving his speech?
I don't recall that, but it sounds exactly like what she would do.
Yeah, she was calling him all kinds of names, and they didn't do anything,
Yeah, I wish they would have had her removed.
Yeah. And one more thing, Attorney General Pam Bondi, she's in charge of the task force for anti-Christian activities. And today is Ash Wednesday, the beginning of Lent. Are they going to round up anybody without ashes on their forehead?
Who knows? Who knows? Okay. I mean, after she was able to get her boyfriend into the Oval Office to shout at Zelensky, who knows? She's a piece of work. By the way, when they took shots of her last night, did you notice that she was sitting there chewing gum very vigorously? And if that doesn't sum that woman up, I'm sorry. I sometimes chew gum, but to sit at an event like that where you know you're going to be on camera, just chewing away, I'm sorry. I don't like her very much.
No, gum chewing is a bad habit.
Public.
Yeah.
I might chew gum, but I'm not going to chew gum when I'm on camera.
Right.
Or at a important event.
Yeah.
There's a time and a place for everything. Ron, thank you.
Okay,
thank you so much for calling in. We got time for one more. Let's go to our good friend Jim from Chicago. Hello, Jim.
Hi, Joan. No bookie on earth would have put the under on that speech because he's the Atlas of politicians. He has to speak longer because if he doesn't, he'll keep speaking until they take him off speed first. I don't know if you talked about that 4-5 decision at the Supreme Court today or yesterday, where they're following the Constitution. That the formality of once the House passes the purse, they get to spend the money. I don't know what the 4 dissenters had in mind, but is the Constitution and the Smithsonian Institute, is it just crumble in there and turn into yellow paper, and then 1,000 years from now, some archaeologists will come and say, what was this thing, the Constitution? Because apparently they've thrown it out the window. But anyway, Joan, thanks for taking my call, and have a good day. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Always appreciate it. Somebody said, I'm confusing Pam Bondi with Marjorie Taylor Greene. Bleached blondes, bad-built butch bodies. Pam Bondi, who is being every bit as corrupt as we expected her to be. And frankly, nobody should be surprised by that, because that's why he put Bill Barr as head of the DOJ when he was in the presidency, because Bill Barr, though he would love for you to believe otherwise, was just an errand boy for Donald Trump until Donald Trump's time came to an end, and then suddenly Bill Barr wanted to rewrite history. That's going to do it for us right now. We're going to take a break for the news. We're going to be back with more after this.
Don't turn that dial.
A dangerous mistake to make.
Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive, returns right now on WCPT 820.
I am very pleased to welcome back to our program, excuse me, Jeet Heer, National Affairs correspondent and columnist for The Nation magazine, host of its weekly podcast, The Time of Monsters with Jeet Heer. Jeet, how are you today?
Oh, I'm doing okay.
I have to tell you,
from last night's speech.
Yeah. I have to tell you that if ever that title was appropriate, it feels like now. When I was, I couldn't finish it. I couldn't finish it. He was so, I knew he was going to say things that weren't true, but he was so smug. And, he knew how to say things that were going to get the Republicans to applaud. America's back. We're the greatest, blah, blah, blah. And I couldn't do it. I could not do it. Alcohol wasn't even going to help last night. And,
Yeah, no. I mean, I have a higher tolerance for listening to Trump than normal people do. But I have to say, even for me, it was like a real bludgeon. And it was a speech aimed for the converted. It was like a rally speech, the type of things he gives when he travels around and does it for the MAGA fans, except it was in front of Congress. And I actually think, like, going forward, probably the Democrats would be well advised just to skip these speeches altogether. Like, there's no point if he's just going to give a rally speech to, like, honor it or to pretend that this is like a normal presidential address. Like, it's just he's just. Having said that, I mean, on the other hand, I have to say we have to understand the politics of it. And I will say this one thing for Trump is that he understands politics is 24/7. Like, it's like there's a permanent campaign. You always have to be rallying your people to put pressure, not just on the opposition, but especially the sort of wavering people on your own side. And I think that's what a lot of this was intended to do, to kind of keep the Republicans in tow and to remind Republicans in Congress, you know, who the boss is. And also the members of Trump's own cabinet. I noticed that he said, that Marco Rubio will have some difficult tasks, and good luck, Marco. So just like, just to remind Marco Rubio who's the boss.
I heard somebody speaking, I think it was Claire McCaskill, who said, she knew Marco Rubio and she knew what he cared about and she knew what was important to him. And she said that she just can't imagine what goes on inside his mind for him to be able to do and say the things that he does. And by all accounts, after Donald Trump and J.D. Vance yelled at Zelensky, they got on the phone with Rubio and said, Rubio, you've got to tell them they got to leave. Is it really... You've observed people in the halls of power, and I know that once people get a taste of that, it's really not something they want to give up. But is it worth selling your soul for?
Personally, I wouldn't do it, and certainly in Trump's first term, we saw there's a kind of revolving door with a lot of people came in and out very quickly. This time, we'll see. I think the Republican Party has become more Trumpized, and I think you have to understand from the point of view of someone like Rubio, he's still a relatively young man. What's his future? It's only like within the Republican Party, really. And if the Republican Party is going to be Trumpist, then he has to, kiss the ring.
But what if Trump kicks him to the curb the way in his first administration? I don't know how many of Trump's cabinet members either resigned or were forced to resign. What is Rubio's future if he has totally
wouldn't endorse Trump for re-election? This time he has going out of his way to subdue, humiliate the people around him, and also to have like real hardline loyalists. And he has more instruments. I think with Elon Musk and these other tech billionaires, they can also like ruin, through social media and through campaign spending, anyone that bucks the line. So you have a much more subservient Republican Party than you had in the first term. And I think a lot of what Trump is doing is, it's partially to sort of troll the liberals, troll the Democrats, but also rally the troops so that all the Republicans know that Trump is the guy in charge. He's the boss of the Republican Party. You can't, if he does something like on Ukraine that you don't like, well, who's the boss? He's the boss. You have to do what he says, not what your conscience might say. So, in that sense, I think the speech was very indicative of, how he wants to govern and how he is governing. And, it's pretty grim stuff. And, the Democrats are still, I think, struggling to figure out how to respond to something like that. But having said, since these are going to be rally speeches rather than presidential addresses, I honestly think it's a trap to even just go there. I think, all the Democrats should just immediately boycott these events. This guy is not going to be saying anything of interest to Democrats.
Do you think... I think you're right. I think he wanted to remind Republicans who's in charge, and he wanted to remind Republicans that there's his way, and that's the only way. Do you also think that part of what last night was about was showing that he's still the boss, not Elon Musk, who's been getting all the press?
Yeah, I think there was maybe a little bit of that. I mean, he did do a kind of like a call out. Actually, I mean, in some ways, he kind of messed up his own strategy because for legal reasons, they've been saying that Musk is not the boss of Doge. Actually, I think Trump during the thing did actually say he was running Doge, but very much it was like, like running the Department of Government Efficiency on behalf of Trump. So I mean, I think a lot of it was about, that sort of basic primate territorial dominance, right? Like, show you're the top ape and get all the other apes to kind of, bow down before you.
Interesting. We need to take a break. Let's do it now. I am talking with Jeet here, who's the national affairs correspondent and columnist for The Nation magazine. We're going to be back with more after this.
If you've missed any of today's show, you can listen on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, YouTube, Amazon, or HeartlandSignal.com. Just search for Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive. Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive. Every weekday afternoon from 2 to 5 p.m. on WCPT 820.
Joining me is Jeet here. He's the national affairs correspondent and columnist for The Nation magazine and also host of its weekly podcast, The Time of Monsters. Jeet, you said something a few minutes ago about not only people being afraid of Donald Trump, but also being afraid of being primaried because of Elon's apparently limitless supply of money to waste on campaigns and primary challenges. Supposedly, from what has drifted out, Joni Ernst was going to kill Pete Hegseth's nomination to lead the DOD. She had the power to kill it while it was still in committee. Every time she did an interview, she was very vague about her conversations with him, about her stance on him. It was pretty apparent as a former sexual assault survivor and as a former huge supporter of our military that she thought he was wildly unqualified. Then all of a sudden, she went quiet, and then all of a sudden, she voted for Pete Hegseth. And people, I'm not familiar with what goes on in the state of Iowa that she represents, but supposedly Elon had started buying, doing a big media buy, not trashing her, but promoting Pete Hegseth and what a great guy he was. And I'm sure it didn't take much of a jump in the thought process to realize that this same amount of money could be used to go after her. And I think it was a survival thing. But people have told me that if anybody could have stood up to Elon Musk, it should have been her. She's very, very popular in Iowa. Iowa is not, it's a very conservative state, but it doesn't always just fall into line. And people were saying that if anybody could have stood up to a pressure campaign from Elon Musk, it could have been her, and yet she didn't. Does that mean there's no hope?
I think that there's not a lot of hope. I mean, I think one would be foolish to put hope on the Republicans in the Congress or the Senate or the House. And it's not just Elon Musk. I mean, when RFK Jr. was up, there were like members of the Senate, who were doctors who were, had concerns about his anti-vax thing. And Nicole Shanahan, who, is because of a divorce, has a huge amount of money from Google, I believe, basically said, and had been RFK Jr.'s running mate, said, like anyone that, votes against Bobby, I'm going to primary. I'm going to finance the primary. So I think that's a huge thing. And I think what we've seen over the last 10 years is that this is the real sort of pivot in terms of where Trump has power. Like, the people that Trump promotes don't always win the elections. In fact, they often lose at a sort of state level or a district level. But at the primary level, where the real sort of hardcore Republicans are, Trump endorsement is already a powerful thing. You put that up against also all the money, and then we have Senate campaigns that run into the tens or hundreds of millions of dollars. I think that these things. This is where Trump has a chokehold. The primary threat, and I don't think one should underestimate, there's a sort of political future threat, but also just physical violence threat. And there has been some good reporting that, there are Republicans in Congress who are just afraid that if they buck Trump, there'll be a sort of social media deluge. And
there was some actual reporting that death threats against himself and his family is part of why Tom Tillis voted for Hegseth when he was dead set against him.
And Mitt Romney, when he when he was in the Senate, because he's quite wealthy, was able to spend the thousands of dollars a month on security for himself and his family that you kind of need to do for this. But I don't think, every member of Congress has that luxury. I think that the Republicans in Congress either ideologically agree with this, as many do, and the ones that don't, that might have a caveat here and there, they are living in fear of being primaried and also just fear of their physical safety.
I have a question, Jeet. Chris Murphy very recently said that unless Republicans join the Democrats in standing up to Donald Trump, he predicts that we will lose our democracy in as little as 6 months. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I don't know, the exact scenario that's going to happen. What I would say is that the path is already there in the sense that, the American system under the Constitution is a system of checks and balances. And what you're supposed to have is, the Congress acting as a check on the president and the courts acting as a check. Now, what we're seeing is two separate things. One is what we've just talked about, where the people in the Republicans in Congress who have the majority, they are not acting as a check on Trump. They're towing the line out of fear. The second thing, the courts are coming to rulings that are against Trump, but we have seen that the Trump White House is not obeying those rulings, and then it becomes it is already a constitutional crisis because it is a question, as it was said before in American history, the courts make the law, then who will enforce them? Who will
exactly? I know that for some of the courts, the enforcement arm is the U.S. Marshals, but they're under Pam Bondi, for God's sake.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think I would say that the lineaments of turn against democracy are basically already there. I mean, how far Trump will go. Whether at some point some Republicans, and the thing is to also remember is he doesn't have a lot of, edge. There's a very bare majority in the House. And in the Senate, there are people who have previously, bucked the line with Trump. And if there are enough of them, something could happen. But it's a very I think the Murphy's prediction is basically plausible. I don't want to make any guesses in the timeline, whether it's 6 months, 18 months. The period between now and the midterms is going to be crucial. We'll see how far Trump goes, and we'll see how much the institutions can resist him. I mean, having said that, I think it's also the case that, like Republicans are afraid of being primaried, but, they also have to fear what happens to their party in the midterms. And it is the case that a lot of what Trump's doing is very unpopular. They're getting a lot of heat in town halls. They're going to cancel town halls now, which, indicates where the direction is going. I think, they could, if there's enough of them in the sort of swing districts, they're between the devil and the deep blue sea. So they're going to have to pick their poison, right? Like, are you more afraid of Trump, or are you more afraid of your own voters? And I think that there are pressure points that can be applied.
Someone, one of the pundits that was on MSNBC said that where we're really going to see Republicans potentially resisting or trying to soften some of Trump's worst moves is when the budget comes up for these reconciliation negotiations, that's where, because they said, well, that's when Republicans, are going to have to put their name beside these votes. And if the budget contains huge unpopular things like sweeping cuts to Medicaid, those are things that they're going to have to put their name on and then live with. So sort of the person was sort of saying Trump's going to be Trump tonight, and there's going to be lots of pushback and complaints and marches. But where you're really going to see what's really going to happen is when these budget reconciliation discussions start taking place. Do you agree with that?
I think that is the sort of Democratic Party strategy going forward, that they think that once it comes to the budget, the Democrats will have a lot more leverage. I think that I think Trump is going to have a very hard time in getting his legislative agenda passed. But I mean, that's why they're doing all this DOGE stuff, right? It is almost deliberately designed to bypass Congress. I think that Trump and the Republicans in Congress know they can't really get this through Congress. They're going to try the other methods, executive orders as well. And I mean, to me, the question then becomes how much resistance is there going to be to DOGE? And then one just saw this, up to the level of the Supreme Court, the cuts at USAID are not going to be allowed. But having said that, then, we get into this tricky area of who's going to enforce this.
Yeah. Charlie Sykes suggested, it is the beginning of Lent. We saw a number of people with their ashes that they get to remind them that it's 40 days of atonement and introspection. Charlie Sykes suggested, because people tend to give something up for Lent, deny themselves something. He suggested that we give up insanity for Lent. Do you think that's an idea that'll sell? Let's give up the insanity just for the next 40 days. Just for the next 40 days.
I don't know how much Trump is a follower of rituals, considering the fact, that this is the 2 Corinthians guy. So I feel like he doesn't have a pious bone in his body. So I mean, Trump's the president, and I honestly think the only really pivot point is organizing, and what people are doing now, going and protesting Republican Congresspeople in swing districts, putting the heat on them. They could actually be in a position, if they are more scared of their own voters than they are of Trump, then we have a chance. And I think it is the time to remind them who's the boss. I mean, that's what I said about the, Trump speech. Trump's speech was, "I'm the boss." Well, I'm sorry. Like in American democracy, the voters are the boss.
Yep.
And I think, unless there's a continued concerted effort to really keep raising the temperature, keep making Republicans aware where voters stand and how much trouble they're going to be in with voters, and that the voters are the boss and not Trump, there's not going to be a change. I don't think one can put one's faith in anything else other than that. I don't think I think the other Democratic strategy is to rely on the courts, and I do think the courts are going to come out against Trump on a lot of this stuff. But is Trump going to listen? You tell me.
That's the part that scares me, because we've always been a country where you might not like the ruling, but you accept it as what is legal in this country, accepting the rule of law. And I'm not sure that Trump's going to do that. And that's where I think we're going to really be in crisis mode, where the courts, even if the Supreme Court rules against him and he says, you know what, too bad, I'm going to do what I want to do. That's when we have to figure out who the heck we are as a country.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no. I mean, I think that we are at a kind of crisis point, and I would. I tell listeners is now is the time to organize, and I think that the hope people have to understand it's not nobody else is going to save you.
That's right.
It's not going to be the political party. It's not going to be like the DNC. Mm-hmm. It's not going to be like Robert Mueller. Coming up, some special prosecutor. The only block, to stop this, descent into autocracy is going to be the American people.
Yep. I couldn't agree with you more. Thank you for joining us again. Jeet Heer is the national affairs correspondent and columnist for The Nation, also hosts its weekly podcast, The Time of Monsters with Jeet Heer. Jeet, thank you, as always.
Oh, great to talk. Thank you.
We're going to take a break. We're going to be back with more after this.
Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive on WCPT 820.
We are going to refocus our attention locally for a few minutes. As you know, I am a big fan of Injustice Watch. They do some of the best investigating, particularly around people in government and branches of government, arms of government. There was some reporting recently that they did about the Cook County Circuit Court and some of the stuff that should be getting done. They said it was getting done, but it might not be getting done the way you think it's getting done. How's that, Dan Finkel, for a really confusing explanation?
How are you doing, Joan? Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Okay, try to make it a little clearer, if you would.
Okay. So we looked into the past of the Cook County Conviction Integrity Unit, which is a thing in the prosecutor's office that was set up in 2012 to investigate innocence claims and wrongful convictions, basically free people who are they find they can't support their for whatever reason they don't think they belong in prison anymore, who are claiming actual innocence. And we looked at this thing over the course of the last two the state's attorney administrations, Kim Foxx and Anita Alvarez. And what we found were, in short, the headline here is a lot of conflicts of interest in the unit. Prosecutors who had worked on cases, back in the day, and then the cases come back before the unit. We found 21 cases cases where people had reached out to the unit, or the case came before the unit in one way or the other. The unit said no, and then later prosecutors were compelled to drop the cases and free the people in most of those cases. So I guess in short, the unit has received a lot of attention for how many exonerations it has been responsible for, and indeed it has more than any comparable unit nationwide, largely owing to throwing out a lot of cases that you can trace back to one particular corrupt cop, Sergeant Watts. But it's really more complicated than just that record of throwing out a lot of cases. There's also, questions about the judgment that they've shown in these 21 cases we found in the conflicts of interest.
The 21 cases that you have found, do they in that paperwork, does it say why we said no to this one? Is there a common thread?
So that's interesting. Not always, or very generally, the data that the Cook County State's Attorney's Office provided to us was pretty incomplete. And it doesn't really go very far toward explaining why they said no to people. And in a lot of those cases, I went and got paper records, to sort of support my reporting. And what I found was in a lot of those cases, your innocence claim could be sitting at this thing for years, as was the case with Kevin Jackson. And the way you find out that they're saying no is they send you a 2-paragraph form letter that says, we don't see any reason to overturn your conviction at this time. And yeah, I think generally a lot of the people who applied to it were left wondering why.
That's so interesting. Are there published guidelines? Okay, these are the cases we look at. These are the ones that don't. They have to be referred this way. They have to have these elements. If there isn't that sort of clarity, shouldn't there be?
Well, they have rules about what they will and will not look at. I'm not sure this has been the case, for all time, but a general thing with CIUs is, we don't look at self-defense cases, right? Like, it has to be sort of an actual innocence. I was misidentified as the person who did this crime type situation. And they also don't take cases where the person has an active appeal. And in a lot of cases, it looked like they said no to people who had active post-conviction cases too. So they have these parameters around who they will and will not review. Yeah.
Interesting. So give me an example. Pick one case that should have been considered and wasn't, and explain to me who was involved, what were the parameters. Walk us through it on a more intimate, anecdotal level.
Well, rather than talking about one where they didn't look at it, I think that Kevin Jackson is a guy who is featured really, really, there's a lot about Kevin Jackson in our story. And that's because I think that he's really illustrative of some of the problems that we're talking about here. Kevin was convicted of a murder in 2001. He was convicted despite the fact that every purported witness to the shooting on the South Side had recanted before trial, had said, even before they went to trial, that either they weren't there or that they were there and Kevin wasn't the guy who pulled the trigger, right?
Let me stop you right there. When that's the case, isn't the prosecutor supposed to look at that? Because I know prosecutors, they want to win. And if, let's see, all of the witnesses now say they weren't there or he's not the guy. This doesn't seem like the kind of case that I should be moving forward with. So why didn't that happen?
Well, that's a good question. I'll tell you what did happen, which is that they took all the witnesses and put them on the stand anyway and impeached them with their prior statements to police, right? Like, so what basically you get the witness up there and you say, well, didn't you tell the police before this that actually this is what happened? And that worked. And they got a conviction. And Kevin Jackson went away, and in 2012 he wrote to the CIU, or a representative did, I'm not sure which, and he, it sat for a couple of years, and he was rejected, or he may have been rejected the next year. I apologize. But then he took another shot at it in 2019. And in 2019, after that came in, they rejected him again. What Kevin told me was that he just didn't know why they kept saying no to him. He couldn't figure it out. He looked at his case and he's saying to himself, this is a bad case. Like, why don't they see what I see in this?
Yeah.
And his answer, the state's attorney's office, or people in the state's attorney's office would dispute this, but what he regards as the answer is that he found out in 2022 that a prosecutor who had been in the conviction integrity unit was married to the detective who helped put together his case, Brian Forberg.
That doesn't seem quite right either. Isn't that a sort of a conflict?
We found that kind of thing a lot in this story, and what Kim Foxx's office did. His lawyers made something of a stink about it. They sent an open letter to the media and various parties in 2022. And Kim Foxx's office appointed special prosecutors who took a couple years to investigate and came back and said, we think Kevin should be released promptly. They felt that the evidence was very thin. They criticized the CIU's investigation as having been incomplete. Then Kevin walked free in October, and his story is told pretty fulsomely in our story.
Wow. And what recourse does somebody like this have now? I mean, can he sue for inappropriate prosecution? Is there any, for the time and the emotional toll and everything he's been through? Is there any recourse?
Well, I mean, typically the dynamic here is that when people are exonerated, they frequently do sue. They usually target the city more so than prosecutors because police have a somewhat lower degree of immunity generally than state's attorneys do, just as a rule. But Kevin has only been out a few months, and he has not. There's no litigation filed on his behalf. But generally, yes, when people are exonerated, they sue the police and or prosecutors.
So you found 21 cases similar to Kevin's. What were some of the reasons? Oh, poop, we need to take a break. Hang on, Dan. We're talking about an Injustice Watch investigation into the Cook County Exoneration Unit that apparently 21 times fell down on the job and did not exonerate someone who deserved it. We'll be right back after this.
Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive. Every weekday afternoon from 2 to 5 p.m. on WCPT 820.
Dan Hinkle is with Injustice Watch, and he was part of a new report that you can find on the Injustice Watch website about the Cook County Exoneration Unit. This is a unit that was designed to free people who have been wrongly prosecuted, wrongly convicted. But for at least 21 people, the system didn't work the way it should. So, first of all, Dan, how did you go about investigating this?
Well, actually, the credit for some of that goes to one of my editors, Joan Newman, who had this imperfect but useful data set from the state's attorney's office that showed people whose cases had been before the conviction integrity unit. And I guess the germ of the idea was that a lot has been said about, this unit. It's been pretty heavily promoted by the state's attorney's office, and it's gotten a lot of attention for the exonerations that it's done. But the idea between myself and my editors was, let's look at this thing. Let's take a bigger look at it, right? Like, let's find the story within the story here. And as I got going and I started looking at the data, I did start finding all of these cases where, it appeared that the unit had said no, and then for whatever reason, the prosecutor's office was later forced to let them have their freedom. And so we really reported those cases out, and we sought photographs of the people in question, and our great in-house artist Vera Martinez did a whole bunch of her usual illustrations that she does for us, and that's the package you see online.
So we heard about one case that you've described to us where that probably shouldn't have been prosecuted in the first place, and because of an inappropriate relationship or wasn't given the consideration it should have gotten. That seems like a one-off, Dan. I mean, you can see that happening, yes, absolutely, but it doesn't seem like all 21 of your cases were attributable to, the prosecutor and then the cops having some kind of personal relationship. What are some of the other reasons why these things went awry?
So just to speak to the conflicts for a second, we found 4 cases in which either a prosecutor or their spouse linked to the unit had been involved with the case in an early stage. So Kevin, yes, it was not all 21, but it was a handful of cases within that. It seems like there's kind of a diversity of ways that these cases were rejected. Some of them, the data don't make real clear exactly what happened, but it's clear that the CIU only entertained the case very briefly. In others, there were years-long investigations. In some of them, it appears that people were rejected twice. There are, I should say that in certain cases, there's at least one where there was a general rule in the office, at least for some years, that you had to choose either the regular courts, right, the post-conviction track, or the CIU. And in a couple of those cases from the data, it does look like, that they chose the post-conviction track, but nonetheless meant that the CIU then did not look into it, or didn't carry out a full investigation.
So, who have you presented these findings to? Anyone in a position to do anything about it?
Well, I will say that the person who is presumably in the best position to do something about it is the new state's attorney, Eileen O'Neill Burke. We sought comment from her for quite a while, and didn't get it. I asked for an interview and didn't get that. I eventually did see her speak at a Union League Club of Chicago event, where she said basically that she was going to continue on with the conviction integrity unit, and she was, she sort of supported the staff that they had in place. But I wasn't really able to ask her any detailed questions about what her plan is.
Do you think, in the interest of politics, that maybe she didn't want to sit down for an interview because she didn't want to, maybe trash Anita Alvarez or Kim Fox but, she kind of came in with some of what we've done is great, but I'm also going to do things a little bit differently. So I don't understand what her hesitation would be. If there have been times when this unit, which apparently she still believes in, went awry, wouldn't she want to talk to the people who could give her that information? I'm confused.
Yeah, I couldn't speak to her mindset, but I will tell you I'd love to talk to her about it still.
And I just don't understand. I understand politicians that don't want to talk about something that will reflect badly on themselves. It's not like you're going in there and saying, Eileen, you screwed up and your people screwed up. I mean, that's not a conversation anybody wants to have. But, you're saying this happened before she got into office. I don't know. If it were me, I think I'd want to know what you had to say, Dan.
Yeah, I think that's a valid question. And I would really, I wish we had been able to talk to her. I still would like to talk to her about this. I'm going to keep following it. I'm going to see what, I think there's a big question as to what the new administration chooses to do as it relates to innocence claims. And that's something I would dearly love to ask the state's attorney herself.
I know that in the report summary that I got, it said that the people who either were rejected or were kept waiting for years, they ended up as a total spending 120 years in prison. Which one of the cases that you looked at spent the most prison time? Can you tell me about that one?
So the calculation was it's from the time you get in touch with the CIU, right, but from the time the CIU finds out about your case to when you actually get out. And I'm not looking right at the records, but if Kevin Jackson is not the one, he's it's a long time. Kevin, because this unit was founded in 2012, and he reached out to them that year and didn't get out until this fall. So, yeah, I think it's him.
Whether or not you talk to the new state's attorney, the fact that you have done this work and published this work, Jen, do you have any belief that things will be done differently going forward?
I guess I can't predict the future. I really, really don't know. I know that there are a lot of things that I'm going to be watching. Like, for example, I'll want to know if, is the person who leads it now going to be leading it into the future? That's not something I was able to ask the new state's attorney. Will they change a big issue? That
leadership of the unit.
Right, and there's a question. The story kind of dwells on the question of whether it is a good idea to have this kind of work done entirely or almost entirely by career prosecutors. And virtually everybody I spoke with, from Kim Fox to a former leader of the unit to various national experts, said, no, this would be better done with people from outside the office, with some outside experience, with some defense experience. And, that's something I think to watch for is what are they going to do? What will future state's attorneys do about that?
If not a prosecutor, would it be some sort of ombudsman type person? What do you see?
I think it would still be the way it worked in the past is that they did actually have a person with outside experience for 2 years. He's a gentleman by the name of Mark Rodert, who had been a defense attorney and a state and federal prosecutor. And you hire that. They hired him into the office. He became an assistant state's attorney, but he told me that he brought that experience to bear, his defense experience to bear in looking at these cases. So that's how it worked, is you'd get hired into the office and bring all the experience that you have to that.
Mm-hmm. So you think it would be best served by somebody who has legal training, maybe as a defense lawyer, as opposed to being a member of the prosecutorial staff, somebody who can maybe do this kind of work without, stepping on toes?
Right. That's certainly the consensus among, the sort of expert class. And both Kim Fox and Mark Rodert said that as well. I think that there's, the experts that I spoke with, raised the point that, how can you really expect anyone to look at the work of their colleagues, and especially if they're longtime colleagues and you're very committed to the institution, how can you expect those people to really look fairly at these claims that sometimes very pointedly accuse your colleagues of making some very big mistakes?
Yeah, just on a human level, Dan, that is a lot to expect of somebody. I know there are people who are capable of doing it. We look at police and, the members of internal affairs are members of the police department. But it takes a special kind of person to be able to look into the behavior of somebody you might know and somebody you might like, maybe somebody you even respect. I can see where bringing in an outsider might be the wisest way to go. When do you think you'll get some signals from Eileen? If she says she supports this unit, she wants the work to continue, if there are going to be changes in leadership, any idea when we would see that?
That's a great question. I really don't know. Like I say, I wish I was in some kind of contact with the state's attorney, but I can't say that I am. I really don't know. But all I know is I'm going to keep watching.
Mm-hmm. Keep watching and keep an eye on the numbers. What else have you been working on?
Well, let's see. I started this sort of shortly after we wrapped up our judicial guide. I think you're familiar with that, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I'm a big believer in the Injustice Watch judicial guide. I talked about it on the air all the time.
Yeah, and we don't have one coming up for a little while, but eventually the time will come. So that was what I was up to most recently. I think right now I'm sort of focusing on trying to find ways to follow my story, right? On getting tips from people who read the story and trying to monitor what's going on in the office as best I can without a lot of, formal buy-in from the office as to what I'm doing. And yeah, that's basically it. We're not going to give up on this storyline, and I just want to keep following it and see what happens.
Do you get calls or notes from defense lawyers saying, I think my client is experiencing what you wrote about? Do you get that kind of outreach?
Well, in reporting the story, it's not actually a particularly large community of attorneys who typically end up with the kind of cases we're talking about, right? And, I've been in the business for long enough to know a lot of the names. And I honestly, even so, was a little bit surprised when I started calling these folks and asking questions about the CIU, how much they had to say about it, right? How many of them, and this is described in the story, that some of them just said, well, I don't trust it. I think it's a waste of time. And a lot of them had particular people that they wanted to talk to me about, and that's reflected in the data. And so, yeah, a lot of the story is, some parts of the story are come from, my experiences talking with lawyers who had these particular experiences long before I even got onto the CIU story. Yeah.
There aren't too many stories that I reported when I was a television reporter that there weren't too many beats that I was on that I think, oh my gosh, I wish I could still do that again. For a long time I was on the murder beat, and that was one I would never wish on anybody. But covering court cases, I always found really, really fascinating. It's just the people involved, judges, lawyers, defendants, their families. It's, you're coming up against them at what could potentially be one of the most important parts of their entire life. And there's a real intensity to that that I found really engaging. And I think you feel the same thing. And I'm glad you are still doing it and are doing it so very well, Mr. Hinkle.
Thank you, Joan. I really, really appreciate that.
Well, I'm a big fan of Injustice Watch in general. And please give David Kidwell a big kiss for me, okay, next time you see him?
I can't promise that, but I'll give him your regards, certainly.
All right. Be a little brave, Dan. Be a little brave.
All right. Thank you, Joan. I really appreciate it.
You can find Dan Hinkle's reporting. Go to injusticewatch.org. They do wonderful, wonderful work, the kind of work that it really takes long hours and long days to do. But it is really important work, particularly since a lot of times we don't get those kinds of investigations from local news outlets the way we once did a long time ago. So organizations like Injustice Watch are more important than ever before. So please read it, bookmark it, support it if you can. They really do great work. We are going to take a break for news, and when we come back, we are going to talk with a professor of law from Northwestern and the co-founder of Democracy Partners. It's just such a quiet day. I'm not sure what we'll chat about, but I promise you we'll find something. We'll be right back after the news.
It's time for Joan Esposito on WCPT 820, Chicago's Progressive Talk.
Mike Lux is the co-founder of Democracy Partners and creator of the Soul of the Party Substack. And I really like what he writes. I want to talk to him about a couple of his most recent articles. Mike, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me on, Joan. I really appreciate it. And I'm glad that Chicago has some progressive talk.
Yes. We're very glad about it, too. I want to talk to you. I've talked to a couple of people in the last week or so who've referenced James Carville's most recent comment about how Democrats should just play dead. and let, the worst of Trump happen and then somehow swoop in right before the midterms and make sure everyone knows that they're there to save them. I think that's a mistake. And I think you do, too. Mike wrote an article. The problem with pretending to be dead is that you get killed sometimes. Talk about James Carville.
Well, and just to be clear, I'm not one of those folks who think James is terrible and on everything. James is an old friend of mine. We worked together on many campaigns over the years, and he's a good guy, and he's right about a lot of things. He's not right about this. We can't afford to play possum because we're dealing with fascists. And fascists, if you give in to fascists, if you don't resist fascists will bury you. And that is what Trump is trying to do. He's trying to bury us in this load of, I don't know if I can swear on your radio show.
Probably not. Bullpucky, maybe?
Yeah, there we go. He's literally trying to bury us, and we can't afford to in any way be passive. So that's one of my arguments with James. The other is this. In all of the focus groups that I was doing before the election and all of the polling that we were doing, what came through loud and clear is that what people don't like about Democrats more than any other thing is that they think of us as weak. They think of us as not fighting for them. Mm-hmm. And what they want is people who will fight for them. Most people are not living, as my mom might have put it back in the day, the life of Riley. Most people are not hanging out, enjoying the good life. They're going through a lot of tough things. Working class folks, especially, all those folks that Democrats have been losing in recent years. I mean, in one of our recent surveys, we found that we asked people a whole battery of questions about what they've been going through in their own lives. Have they lost they or a close immediate family member lost a job in recent years? Had they had their house foreclosed on in recent years? Had they lost their health coverage in recent years? Just a whole set of questions like that. And more than half of the people we surveyed answered yes to more than half of those questions. These folks are going through really tough times. And then you put on inflation on top of that. And that was a killer for folks on limited incomes who were already having trouble making it. And so they want someone who will go out there and fight the good fight for them. They want someone who will engage in the battle to make their lives better. And I'll just close that thought with this. When we would ask people in focus groups what they thought about Kamala Harris talking about how she would listen to anybody, she would talk to anybody, these working class folks would say, well, she's not going to be talking to me. She's not going to be coming to my neighborhood to talk. I'm sure she'll talk to, the Republicans in Washington. I'm sure she'll talk to, the various corporate lobbyists who are out there. It's great that she's friends with Liz Cheney, but who's going to fight for me? Who's going to talk to me? And people just found the whole notion of just being nice to everybody in Washington, that they were not interested in that. They were interested in somebody who's going to fight for them. And then what they would say about Trump is a lot of these folks don't like Trump, but what they say is, at least he's a fighter. I mean, that phrase in focus groups would come up over and over again. Well, I don't like him in a whole lot of ways, but at least he goes out there and he fights. At least he goes out there and he battles. And maybe he'll battle on behalf of Americans. And so we need the last thing we need to do right now is play possum.
Yeah, I think you just hit on something that's very important, because I've been looking at the various articles, most of them in the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal, where they talk to people who voted for Trump and sort of what they're thinking now. And I remember seeing a quote from a young man who said, man, he's really doing things. Now, this young man obviously hasn't done a deep dive into the things that are being done and the harm that is going to be done. But I understood where he was coming from. And I think that's what part of what Trump was touting to his base last night. Like, look at me. Look at all the stuff. I mean, how many gazillions of executive orders have I signed? And we're firing people and we're locking up buildings and we're putting up buildings for sale. And before people start feeling the personal pain of those decisions, I could see where somebody who doesn't spend a lot of time diving past the surface of politics could say, man, whew, that guy, he's done, I heard one quote, he's done more in the first 2 weeks than most presidents do in 4 years.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, he has done a lot of stuff. Of course, all of it's bad. But you're absolutely right. For a regular person who's like, maybe they're working 2 jobs, maybe they're working 3 jobs. They're taking care of kids. They're taking care of aging parents and grandparents. They've got really busy lives, and they don't follow the ins and outs of politics. They don't follow each party's talking points or look at specific legislation or specific executive orders. But they know they want change. They don't like the establishment in Washington. They don't like the establishment, in big cities. They don't like the Wall Street guys. They don't like the big tech guys. And they feel like Trump at least is going to shake things up, that he's not going to be just like your regular old politician.
Well, then they really got what they wanted.
No, I mean that's what they were looking for, and they were. I have a colleague who describes it as this: these are folks who really just want to like flip the bird to the establishment, and they do want things shaken up. So that's an appealing kind of thing. Now, what you said, Joan, is exactly right. When they start feeling the pain, when they start seeing what's really happening and how it affects them, when they see that their grandmother that they're trying to take care of is going to be thrown out of the nursing home because Medicaid is being cut, when they see that same grandmother's not going to, suddenly her Social Security check isn't coming regularly because
or the 24-year-old woman profiled in the Washington Post who voted for Trump, and she works for the Park Service, and she no longer has a job with the Park Service. And it was that same thing. I didn't really like him. I really didn't want to vote for him. But, he said that he would make in vitro fertilization free. And, I'm trying to start a family, and it's not going well. So I thought I'd basically take a chance that, I'd get free IVF.
Exactly. And Trump said a whole lot of things, most of which were not true in any way, shape, or form. But he's a good salesman. He is good.
But Mike, this isn't our first go round with him. The people who think that he's for the working man, do they not remember that he made those same promises before he was elected the first time, and he didn't help the working man at all? I don't understand this. I get, people who aren't into politics like you and me, but I would at least expect people to have a certain amount of memory.
Well, there's a couple of things on that. One is that the people who really were focused on and realized what happened with Trump in the first term they voted in 2020, but 19 million of them who voted in 2020 and voted for Biden in 2020 did not vote this time around.
Yes, and I want to talk to you. Those are the people, I understand, with this, Kamala did this, she didn't do that. Okay, fine. I want to talk about the people who stayed home. That's the group. I want to get into their collective heads. So, Mike, let's take our break right now so we can continue this discussion. Mike Lux, co-founder of Democracy Partners, and you can, on Substack, find him Soul of the Party. We'll be back with more after this. If you're one of the listeners in our audience, a financial planner, a CPA, maybe a divorce attorney, if you want to know why your mortgage professional hasn't returned your calls, it could be because they're out of business. More than 165,000 mortgage professionals have not renewed their licenses in the last 2 years. 165,000 people getting out of the business. So if you want to buy a new home or refinance the one you've got, do what I did. Call Team Hochberg. They really are our trusted local lender. Remember, in the last 2 years, while other companies have been shutting down, Team Hochberg has been adding loan officers. They're stronger than ever, and they would love to earn your business. Call them. You can get a free consultation. And I would strongly urge you to do that, to talk to them before you sign on the dotted line with anybody else. So that number to call, 855-563-2843, or go online, 56david.com. That number again, 855-563-2843, or 56david.com on your computer. Lower.com, equal housing lender, NMLS 1124061.
Don't turn that dial.
A dangerous mistake to make.
Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive, returns right now on WCPT 820.
With me is Mike Lux, co-founder of Democracy Partners, and you can read his Substack. It's called Soul of the Party. I rudely interrupted him as he was about to start to talk about the tens of millions of registered Democratic voters who sat on their hands and stayed home in the last presidential election. And that's the group that really, really puzzles me. Mike, what do you think about that?
Well, I think, again, these are folks who are, as we were talking about before, these are folks who are incredibly busy, incredibly preoccupied with their own family, their own work situation, and they need to be motivated. They need to be mobilized, and I think part of it is the structure of modern campaigns. It's become very tech-oriented as opposed to people-to-people oriented, and I think we don't do a good job of old-fashioned issue organizing. Like, you should turn out to vote because look at these issues. Instead we send strangers to their doors or have strangers call them rather than people that they know, people from their neighborhood. So I think that's one issue. But I think the other thing was this was a tough economy for people, and I think the Biden-Harris administration got too excited about a lot of big picture economic numbers, but inflation really hit people hard.
But these were Democrats. These were people who believe in freedoms and live and let live. And they knew what Donald Trump represented. Whether or not you believed that he was going to implement Project 2025, you knew he was a bad man and a bad president and treated the presidency like he was some kind of mob boss. I don't care if you thought Kamala Harris was the weakest Democrat you've ever come across. The weakest Democrat on their worst day is better than Donald Trump on his best day. How did they not act on that?
Well, I don't think most people are think of themselves as Democrats first or as progressives first, or think in those kinds of ideological terms. They know that their life, for the last 4 years, had been tougher for them than it had in not in the COVID year, but in the first 3 years of Trump's term. Things were actually, okay for a lot of people. And because they weren't following all the details, they weren't following all the stuff, all the ridiculous stuff Trump was doing, they just weren't. 4 years later, 5 years later, they weren't thinking about it that much. They were thinking about how tough their lives were. Now, no, they did not change their vote. They didn't go enthusiastically or in any other way vote for Trump, but it just didn't become a priority to go vote him out again. And I think there's a lot of fault that can be laid.
Every Democrat worth their salt was sounding the alarm and saying this isn't just about Republican versus Democrat. This is about whether or not you believe in our form of government. That message just bounced off, didn't get through, wasn't paid attention to?
Well, I think part of remember, people are very cynical about politicians. And they've heard so many terrible things about politicians from other politicians. You think about, 50 years of negative TV ads, and they feel like politicians exaggerate everything, they overplay everything. And in fact, we were finding in focus groups people saying stuff like, well, the Democrats said Trump would do all these terrible things to democracy last time, and he didn't. We still had another election. We got a new president. They're exaggerating how bad he is, and because they're not following the details, they're not following all the horrible things that he said and did, and in fact they drown out one of the really sinister things that Trump has done is that he's made people turn away from the news. For people who followed the news, they voted for Harris overwhelmingly. But people less and less are following the news because it's so negative and it's so twisted, and people say so many ridiculous things, and I can't follow the news. And a lot of people were literally turning away from the news and not following those details. We have to do a better job of figuring out how to reach people where they are. We have to do a better job. For example, I'll give you one other example, social media. Most people these days, especially those under 40, get the lion's share of their news and information about issues on social media from their friends. And social media right now is dominated by a right-wing infrastructure that has invested tens of millions of dollars into it. And the disinformation coming out is enormous. And so people aren't getting good information. They're getting a whole bunch of puff pieces about Trump and all these horrible things about Biden and Harris. And that plays into it as well. Again, these folks, the people we're talking about, they're not going to vote for Trump. They're never going to vote for Trump. But whether they vote or not is the question. And they just weren't that motivated to vote in spite of Trump's first term.
Are you on social media to try to reach these younger voters? I know you're on Substack. Do you have a TikTok?
I don't have a TikTok yet. I'm on Facebook. I'm on Twitter, which has become terrible. I work with a network of folks who are on a lot of these different platforms, and am able to get out information that way to people. There's a lot of good people who are doing social media on our side. We need more people to do social media on our side. Everybody needs to engage in that. I think a lot of times progressive folks don't engage on social media because it's like, oh, there's too many people saying too many things on social media. I'm just not going to engage. But we need to get into those discussions. We need to be part of a community that engages with people and talks to people about issues. Otherwise, the right wing is just going to dominate that space.
There are some people who work for Courier Media, and Courier Media has also invested in a lot of radio stations, and they're using some of the new technology to simultaneously put their information out on other platforms. You can use something like a Restream or StreamYard, and when you post content, you can set it up so that it goes to Facebook, so that it goes to TikTok, so that it goes to YouTube. I really think that's the wave of the future for people who do progressive media.
Yeah, I agree with you. We need to be using those kinds of channels, those kinds of technologies, and I'm glad you mentioned Courier. Courier does a really good job of building out progressive media infrastructure, which we desperately need. We desperately need that.
Yes, we do.
We need progressive talk, not just in Chicago, but all over the country, in all those small towns, all over the country. But I'm so glad that shows like yours are out there.
Me too. For as long as I can last. Thanks,
well,
Mike.
Keep going.
Thank you, Mike. You too. Mike Lux is the co-founder of Democracy Partners. We are going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to talk to Northwestern professor of law Michael Kang right after this.
Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive on WCPT 820.
Joining me now is Northwestern professor of law Michael Kang. And Devin, is he still there? I heard a little dial tone. Oh, okay. All right. Scared me there. He is the co-author with Joanna Shepard of a book called Free to Judge, The Power of Campaign Money in Judicial Elections. There is a lot riding on the Supreme Court right now, so what a perfect time to talk with Michael Kang. Michael, how are you?
I'm good. Thanks for having me on, Joe.
You know, I heard last night from the many pundits until my hair spontaneously combusted and I had to shut the television off. I heard from many people that the courts, Democrats are counting on the courts. The courts are going to save us. And yet we have, by all accounts, an exceedingly partisan, exceedingly presidential-friendly Supreme Court. Do you think the Democrats who say that are being overly optimistic?
I think sometimes they're being a little optimistic. We have a really hyper-partisan political system right now. Certainly you're right that Congress isn't going to stop the president. It's a little uncertain how much of a check the courts are going to provide on the president. I think there are probably experts and pundits are right to think that the courts are more resistant to executive power and specifically Donald Trump. They've shown in the past, for example, in the election cases, where they're willing to stand up for the law and uphold process over just raw politics. But at the same time, we've seen a lot of the same forces that influence Congress and state politics influence the federal judiciary, too. I think it's fair to say that federal judges are probably more aware of what's going on nationally in politics and perhaps more sensitive to those politics. And that, I think, in the end, probably does affect the way they think about cases. It doesn't mean in the end that they're going to side with their party on all the cases. I think that's almost certainly not going to be true. There are going to be some cases where, for instance, conservative Republican judges and justices are going to disagree with the Trump administration's position on things. But I think it is fair to worry about the problem that there seems to be a lot of cohesion, really on both sides, among Democrats and Republicans. And Republican and Democratic judges, I think today, are more likely to kind of side with their party than maybe they were 50 years ago, where ideology was less important and the system was less polarized. So I think we'll have to see, and I think it may depend on the specific kind of case that comes before the court in figuring out where they land.
Okay, that makes sense. But one of the things that Donald Trump seems to have been toying with recently is simply ignoring court rulings he doesn't like. I believe some of the firings, the courts have said, no, you don't have the standing to do those firings. Those people are not fired. Programs, agencies, no, there's a process that has to go through before something like this is shut down. You didn't go through the process, so everything is on hold. But, like some of the Head Start programs around the country that had their funding stopped and then restarted by the courts are still sending out letters to their parents saying, we have to close because the portal where we get our payments is still not available to us. So even if something gets up to the Supreme Court, even if the Supreme Court finally says no to Donald Trump in some capacity, who's going to enforce it?
Yeah, it's a real problem in our constitutional system. I mean, it's often said that, courts are the weakest branch because they don't have a way to enforce their judgments. They depend on legitimacy and they depend on the other political actors to respect their authority. And this is what people are calling a potential constitutional crisis. I don't think we've reached quite that point quite yet, where the Trump administration is openly defying courts, but they certainly are making a lot of noises about it. And I think it's a real worry. And I think you're also right to point out that in very quiet ways, they're already doing that. They're already defying or making it hard for courts to get their authority heard in our system. And it's not clear exactly what would happen if the Trump administration just says, no, we're just not going to follow. That would be a real constitutional crisis where it's not clear who should do what at that point because the courts really don't have an enforcement authority. They can't send the police to force the federal government to do anything. And at that point, I don't know what the right answers are.
What do we as a country do? Is that when if there's, if Donald Trump wants to do something really bad and the courts say no and he says, stick it, what do we do? What do we do? Is that when we take to the streets?
In a way, yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think the way we've traditionally thought about that sort of challenge is that there are political remedies, that the next election, Donald Trump doesn't get reelected. Obviously, that is not necessarily going to be the case. I think Trump's talked about a third term, but he's constitutionally barred from running again. And that's, I think, given him a certain kind of freedom, at least in his own mind, to do what he wants and not worry about consequences. But maybe other political actors would worry about their own reelection chances and where the Republican Party stands if the Trump administration openly defies the law and does things that are clearly illegitimate, then we would hope at least people would get really angry about it and worried about our political system and punish Republicans politically. You've seen a little bit of that in some of the pushback at these town halls that Republican officials have had, where voters seem pretty angry about DOJ and all of these cuts to the federal government that people don't feel that they voted for. So I think if we get to the point where the Trump administration is just openly defying court orders and doing things that are illegal, we'd have to hope that other political actors feel a lot of pressure to stand up for the law and that we as a citizenry kind of stand up and force them to do that and make it clear we won't stand for it. But our system is really not designed for courts to have to try to enforce their decisions. And I think courts are really wary about that. They know they can't enforce their decisions. And so sometimes historically speaking, sometimes they don't challenge political actors that they think won't respect their decisions because they don't want to.
They don't want to look neutered.
They don't want to lose. Exactly. Yeah, it makes them look bad, and it weakens their institutional authority kind of going forward. So I think that's as big a worry as anything, is not just that the Trump administration won't respect their decisions, but that they'll scale back and maybe make decisions with the worry about Trump defiance in mind, and maybe not do the right thing and uphold the law in ways that we'd expect them to, because they're worried about Trump flouting their decisions. And that's as big a worry as, the Trump administration just openly defying those decisions.
Well, everybody always says about how they're appointed for life so they can do whatever they want to do, but they really do react to public sentiment. I mean, they're human beings. How could they not? But I could see, I could see somebody like Donald Trump communicating privately to them, you better rule this way, because if not, I'm going to defy you, and people are going to understand just how powerless you are. I could see that sort of, that seems very within the realm of possibility.
Yeah, I think Donald Trump is someone who relishes power and enjoys exercising it and really making people feel small and feel they're really subject to his will. He's not shy about it at all. And so I think you're right. I think he's said in the past how he expects the Supreme Court, his justices to decide things, his judges to decide things, especially I think at the lower court level where maybe there's a hope that they can advance professionally, from district court to court of appeals to the Supreme Court. You've actually seen that, a Fifth Circuit judge who was very strongly in support of birthright citizenship has kind of very publicly reversed his position in ways that seem inexplicable, other than he wants to curry favor with the president and maybe get appointed to the Supreme Court someday. So I think all of those things are true. I mean, there are judges who want to have Trump like them because he might reward them, and then there's judges that worry about what Trump will do and worry about the kind of punishments that he might be able to inflict. It's hard to do that against federal judges. As you said, they have lifetime appointments and they're politically insulated. But Donald Trump is not shy about trying to make life bad for his enemies or people he feel like are in his way. And he can put a lot of political pressure on the court in the way he talks about things and rallies his supporters against and for people. And so I do think that the justices probably do feel some pressure to decide things in his direction. And really the internal pressures within the Republican Party are very intense to sort of do the team thing. You see that for sure in Congress, where I think people talk differently depending on whether they're in private and public. They have very different views about Trump, whether you talk to them in private or public. And a lot of that is because of the politics, that Trump is not shy about exerting this kind of pressure to get what he wants. And I don't think justices are exempt from that. They're a little more insulated, but they're not exempt from it.
When in the early days of me doing this show, there was a Republican lawyer who I used to have on periodically, and I stopped inviting him to be on the radio because I realized that he wasn't being truthful. He wasn't like a super loud, Trump or die kind of guy, but he definitely would support the Republican talking points of the minute. And then when we were off the air, he would acknowledge how awful and crazy it all was. And, once I gave him a pass, but when it happened a second time, I was like, you know what? I didn't create this kind of a radio show so that people could be hypocritical, essentially, so that they could, just like they do, drives me crazy when I see a Republican speaking on CNN and they say something that just begs to be challenged. There was a woman, Republican Congresswoman, speaking on CNN this morning who was talking about all the gangs and the terrorists coming across the border from Canada. And I just started yelling. I don't do this very often, but I was yelling at the television, and I was like, for God's sakes, interrupt her. Make her, at the very least, make her double down on that. Make her acknowledge what she just said and make her stick to it. Make her live with it. And, I can't, I can't stand that. And there's so much of that right now because there are very few people, I think, who are really at the upper levels of power who are really MAGA. I think they're mostly just opportunistic. What's good for me today? Where do I need to be today? The Lindsey Graham School of Politics. Michael, we need to take a break. I'm talking to author and Northwestern professor of law, Michael Kang. We'll be back after this.
Joan Esposito, live.
Celebrating our power to bring about change.
Local.
Everybody has to work together.
And progressive.
I think you get the idea.
On WCPT 820.
I'm joined by Michael Kang, author and Northwestern professor of law. And Michael, I've got part of one of your bios in front of me, and it talks about the areas where you do research. And one of the things listed is you do research into sore loser laws. I've never heard that phrase before, and I would love for you to tell me what it means.
Sure, I'm happy to talk about it. I'm one of the very few people who write about sore loser laws at all. So I'm the right person to talk to. They're not well known, so it's not surprised if the most politically sophisticated people know or don't know about them. But basically, they're laws that make it very difficult or outright prohibit someone who loses a party primary from running in the general election. So you run in the Democratic primary, you lose, and you want to run as an independent or maybe as a nominee of another party, a minor party in the general election anyway. This has happened a few times in states where you don't have a sore loser law.
Like I want to, the Dems didn't want me, but I'm now going to run with the Green Party.
Exactly. Yeah. Joe Lieberman did this in Connecticut. It doesn't happen very often because you're sort of turning your back on the party. But on the other hand, they voted you out, so you should have the chance to run. But it is very hard to run as a sore loser. And in fact, they're called sore loser laws as a sort of derogatory term, that these are sore losers. They've lost the primary and they get to run in the general election. But I did some work on this, both empirically and theoretically. And what we find is that those laws are associated with more extreme politics. And the reason is the primaries tend to be controlled by the party bases that tend to be a little bit more ideologically extreme. And when you lose in the primary, often they can be moderate candidates like Lieberman, and they're blocked from running in the general election. And so it tends to filter out moderate candidates. If you get rid of the sore loser laws, sometimes those moderate candidates that lose in the primary are able to run in the general election, sometimes as an independent. And that moderates politics to some degree, because a lot of times in today's environment, the most viable kind of sore losers are more moderate candidates that get filtered out in our kind of hyper-partisan environment. So people hadn't studied this, and I looked at it, and it turns out it has a reasonably large effect on polarization. So if you're worried about extreme politics, getting rid of sore loser laws, it's not a total solution, but it helps a little bit.
I see.
And when we looked at this empirically, it seemed to matter.
That's really fascinating. It makes perfect sense, because I mean, how many times recently have we heard of Democrats and Republicans surreptitiously funding the campaigns of people from another party because they think in the general election that person will be easier to beat. Most recently, like Jeff Jackson ran for attorney general in North Carolina, and a Republican PAC started funneling money to the guy in his own party who was primarying him. And he called it out. He was like, look, this is where the money's coming from. Clearly, they do not want to run their candidate up against me. And he has an incredible reach with social media. He was able to withstand that kind of a primary challenge. But we've seen it here in Illinois. Sometimes when there's a moderate Republican and a radical Republican, and we tend to be a more Democratic state. So sometimes people will do things to try to support the more radical Republican because they know they will be easier to defeat in a general election.
Yeah, exactly. And it's been controversial. I think the Democratic Party and Democratic sponsors have sometimes done that. And I think there's some hand-wringing within the Democratic Party about whether that's the right thing to do, to kind of mess with the other party's primary and kind of play those tricks that I think Democrats have tended to pride themselves in not doing. Whether they're right or not, who knows? But that has tended to be the way that Democrats think about how to play politics. And that's been a recent trend where Democrats have seemed to succeed doing that. If you think about the kind of the most moderate Republican senator right now, it's Lisa Murkowski, and she ran as a sore loser. She lost in the Republican primary. This is a while back, but managed to win in the general election as a write-in candidate, which is very hard to do. But that's one example of a fairly moderate Republican who would have lost and been filtered out of the system in the Republican primary, which tends to be pretty extreme, and was able to run the general election, is actually more appealing to the general election electorate than the Republican primary voters. Yeah. And it can happen on the Democratic side too.
Yeah, I remember a while back locally there was a candidate for Water Reclamation District, one of my favorite things to vote for. And for some reason, I don't know if he was too late to the party or what, but for some reason he did not get slated. And there was this huge campaign to put him down on your ballot as a write-in, and he won one of the seats.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's the primary is one way that our politics have gotten more extreme, is because the party, the voters in the party primaries are more extreme on both sides, on both the Democratic and the Republican side, and they want candidates that are more extreme. And that's fine, but what's happened systemically is when you've got these primary voters demanding more conservative Republicans and more progressive Democrats on both sides, the system as a whole becomes more extreme, and it becomes harder for them to work together. And so I think, getting rid of the sore loser laws is a pretty modest reform. It's not transformational, but it can be a good thing, because I think when I think about American politics today, so many of the problems we have are from hyperpartisanship, that the parties really kind of think of themselves as teams that can't work with the other side at all, and often will forego gains, compromises that would be good for both sides, because they don't want to hand the other side a victory. And that, when President Obama was in the White House, Mitch McConnell's what he said at the very beginning of Obama's presidency was, we want to deny him a second term. Like, that's our goal, and when your goal is something like that, you're not going to work with the other side, and everything's going to be party line. Sometimes it makes sense to do things party line. You've got your principles and you have to stand up for them. And I think that's where the Democratic Party right now is vis-a-vis Donald Trump. I think if you're a Democrat, you should feel really strongly about opposing and resisting what Trump's doing, because it's a fairly extreme agenda. So it's not that you have to work with the other side, but there are ways we can make the system more better for moderates who do have the support of voters, and not let party voters necessarily filter them out in the primary.
Michael, why does it seem like, this is sort of a technical question, why does it seem like some Supreme Court decisions are made very quickly and released? Others, they keep them under wraps till the last possible minute. Is it just sort of whatever they feel like doing on a given day?
Well, the Supreme Court, as we've discussed, has got a lot of political insulation and a lot of discretion over what they do. There's very few cases that they have to take. They take most of their cases.
No, but I mean the cases they take and the cases they hear. It seems like sometimes you get a decision right away, and then other times it's like this big mystery when it will come.
And sometimes it's very strategic. I mean, if you think about the Trump prosecutions, they really let that string out, and they could have decided what ultimately was the Trump versus Anderson decision that gave him immunity. And we've discussed this before on the air.
And when Jack Smith
a lot earlier.
went to them and said, look, I'm doing this case. It's eventually going to end up before you. Let's cut to the chase. Give us your ruling right now. And they're like, oh, no, we're going to let the process work itself out.
Yeah, and I understand sometimes that makes sense, but in that case, it meant that really the prosecution wasn't going to succeed, right? It ran into the election, and then ultimately Trump won. So is that politics? Is that just being careful and, managing the process in a really thoughtful way? I think it's hard to.
Can I answer that? Can I answer that, Michael? Please, oh please. It's politics.
Right. I mean, it's hard to conclude otherwise that that's not part of it. I think in that case they probably didn't want to decide the case if they didn't have to, and they were fine with it if the prosecution ran out of time. I think probably the justices, they really don't want to appear political, but sometimes it's becoming unavoidable to conclude when they are.
Yeah. Michael Kang, author and professor of law from Northwestern. Michael, thank you so much for answering some of my legitimate and some of my silly questions.
Thank you, Joan.
That is going to do it for me. Patty Vasquez is back, but she's not going to be in the studio. She is going to be live broadcasting from New Orleans. That should be cool. She's going to talk to Greg Palast, who unfortunately is not in New Orleans, but he'll be on the phone. Richard Chu will be here tomorrow morning at 6 a.m. with Chu's Views. He's going to be talking to Kelly Hallberg, Scientific Director of the Inclusive Economy Lab at the University of Chicago. That should be interesting. And then I will see you tomorrow at 2 o'clock, and we will have lots of fun. I hope to God. Have some fun this evening. Put your feet up. You've earned it. I will see you tomorrow at 2 o'clock. Have a great evening, my friends, and good night.